It's been an interesting debate. At times it has been focused very much on key issues. At times it has wandered to some extent. But I will deal with the issues in much the way that others have done. First of all, the actions of the convener in bringing forward this unanimous report. He shouldn't be praised too much. There are one or two people within this Parliament who are actually pretty damn good at what they do. Bruce Crawford is one of them, and he delivered once again. Much has been made of the fact that the support for this report was unanimous, but it should not surprise anyone that a Conservative member of this Parliament should have demonstrated commitment to the Smith process. The Smith Commission sat on a relatively short timescale and brought together key ideas at a critical time in Scottish history in the days immediately after the referendum. It did so in an atmosphere which may well turn out to have been unique, and I think it is only appropriate that we should maintain our commitment. There are those who are concerned about the timescale that has been applied. In fact, Christine Graham described it as going forward at breakneck speed. Yet, if you remember, the commitment that was given immediately after the referendum, that there would be a timetable on day one, appeared to have been broken when it took us till lunchtime on day two to put the timetable together. And many on the losing side in the referendum cried betrayal at that very moment. So don't be surprised if timescale remains important to the newly elected UK government. As far as the ability of the individual clauses to translate the desires of the Smith Commission into law and into practice is concerned, there are varying degrees of success with the clauses that have been published. In terms of taxation, I'm particularly happy with what has come forward, but the weakness is perhaps the lack of detail, and issues like the fiscal framework, the concept of no detriment, the practices that will be involved in borrowing, and how we deal with assessing what the Scottish component of VAT actually is, are things that we will have to address as time goes on. It is the case, of course, that that will have to be done through a much stronger governmental framework. And intergovernmental relations are going to be absolutely key to this. And that's why it's a consolation to me to see progress being made on the development of a strong working relationship between our First Minister here in Scotland and our newly reappointed Prime Minister in Westminster. But the process we're involved in is the process driven by the Smith Commission. And it is important that we find ways to ensure that the promises that were made through Smith are brought about. These processes will be easier in some areas than in others. And it is particularly in the area of welfare that my concerns drove me to support the broad view of this committee. And yet, I am content that, having discussed the matter with someone who was involved in the drafting of these clauses, that the intent was to give effect to Smith. However, the clauses as they currently exist remain questionable in my view as to whether they achieve these objectives. For that reason, I think in that area in particular, redrafting is necessary. The issue of the veto, for example, which was brought up on day one after the publication of the clauses, is in my view something of a red herring, but the wording of the clauses as drafted give rise to that concern, and consequently we need to be sure that we know what they mean before we go forward. There are a number of other issues, the Crown Estate, for example, which has thrown up questions since the publication of the draft clauses, which we did not anticipate before their publication. And I believe the Crown Estate issue will only get more complicated before we get to a solution on it. There are other aspects of this debate which I think I have to mention, and that is that we have also had those who have gone off in different directions. There are those who have been more concerned about process than they have about the Smith Commission itself. There are those who are more concerned about how we might use the policies or the policy driver for using the new powers once we have them. I believe that's a step too far during this debate. We need to know what powers we will have before we talk about policy. Perhaps that's something for next year's election campaign. There have also been those who are too concerned about what we might add to this process. I believe it would be a mistake to drop the Smith process, the current process, and simply go off and now try to argue for additional powers in some or other area. It is perfectly appropriate for our two governments to discuss where we would wish to go next, but it would be a foolish error to drop the current process in the hope of something better. I think we have a tremendous opportunity to put together a package of powers which will be coherent and which will deliver for Scotland. We must also remember that we have a process to go through both in this Parliament but much more relevantly in the Westminster Parliament to deliver these new powers. And by virtue of the election that we've just been through, the Scottish National Party itself has a very strong representation in the House of Commons and will have the opportunity to amend and adjust this bill as it goes through Parliament. We must also remember, however, that Parliament has a role. And as we go forward, while the two governments will, of necessity, have to become closer and to have a better working relationship, we must never forget that Parliament must have a role. Don't lock Parliament out. Make sure Parliament has that role, and we can make this work for the benefit of Scotland in the longer term.
Thanks very much.